Thank you very much, Professor. I'm afraid I cannot equal the excellence with which you have presented the tragic situation here in the country. Dobro jutro, Mirdita, good morning, and it's such a pleasure to see all the friends, many friends here. I just wish that the circumstances would be otherwise, but we have to keep hoping. And I would like to thank Professor and all her colleagues for organizing this Tribunus Civilis this morning. There are many features which underpin an authoritarian regime. Perhaps the most all-pervasive one, apart from the one of fear, which was so eloquently mentioned and evoked by Mr. Vanoost earlier, is the crime of silence. Whether it is in Belarus, Zimbabwe, or Macedonia, the climate of fear, the collusion with the autocratic leaders, and the refusal to take a stand or to speak out against the violations of the basic democratic principles and standards, elements which are prevalent in each of these authoritarian regimes, is equivalent to the denial of one's basic human rights and to one's identity as a law-abiding human being. And indeed, the current political crisis in Macedonia responds to that situation. It has its roots in the ethno-nationalist and populist agenda of the current regime, the ruling party, in power since 2006, but an agenda which gathered speed from 2008 onwards. The climate of fear in the population at large is generated by the all-pervasive control of the ruling party over all the state organs, such as the judiciary and public administration, but also the electoral process and the media. Criticism of the government, as we heard, is not tolerated by this regime, and those who dare to raise their voices are regarded as enemies of the state. This includes civil society organizations, which have played such a critical role in monitoring the government's performance and implementing much-needed reforms. And we owe a debt of gratitude to those civil society organizations who continue to do their work despite continued harassment and intimidation by the ruling party. All the reports published by the international community, whether it is by individual governments such as the United States or by organizations such as the European Union and the OSCE, or independent civil society organizations such as Media Without Borders or the Freedom House, all are unanimous in their assessment of the state of democracy, of the rotten state of democracy, or what's left of it in this country. I think it's important to quote from some of these because, unfortunately, those who are particularly targeted by these reports conveniently forget what these reports state. First of all, I'd like to mention the most recent human rights report from the US State Department, which states, and I quote, "Most significant human rights problems in Macedonia stem from high levels of corruption and from the government's failure to respect fully the rule of law, including by continuing efforts to restrict media freedom, interfere in the judiciary, and selectively prosecute offenders. Political interference, inefficiency, cronyism, and nepotism, prolonged processes, violations of the right to public trial, and corruption characterize the judicial system," end of quote. And then we have the European Commission's country report published in November of last year, which states inter alia, "Concerning the political criteria, serious challenges reported in previous years have been underscored by the country's most severe crisis since 2001, with intercepted communications apparently involving senior government officials, suggesting breaches of fundamental rights, interference with judicial independence, media freedom and elections, as well as politicization and corruption. Concerns about all of these issues have been signaled in previous progress reports. the breakdown of political dialogue and difficulties in arriving at consensus on issues highlighted once again the highly polarized nature of society and the political culture in the country. Another report, the special report of the Senior Experts Group on Systemic Rule of Law Issues relating to the communications interceptions, revealed in spring 2015, the so-called PRIBA report, which brought together so many highly respected legal experts from across the European Union. And they referred inter alia, and I quote, firstly, violation of the fundamental rights of individuals concerned. Secondly, serious infringements of the personal data protection legislation. Thirdly, violation of the 1961 Convention on Diplomatic Relations, given that diplomats have been also illegally intercepted. Fourthly, apparent direct involvement of senior government and party officials in illegal activities, including electoral fraud, corruption, abuse of power and authority, conflict of interest, blackmail, extortion, and that refers in particular to pressure on public employees to vote for a certain party with a threat to be fired. And we know that these intimidation practices continue to this day. Criminal damage, severe procurement procedure infringement aimed at gaining an illicit profit, nepotism, and cronyism. And fifthly, indications of unacceptable political interference in the nomination and appointments of judges, as well as interference with other supposedly independent institutions for either personal or political advantages. And finally, the most recent report from Freedom House, entitled Discarding Democracy, Return to the Iron Fist, states in relation to the freedom of the media in Macedonia, and I quote, Macedonia's status declined from partly free to not free due to revelations indicating large-scale and illegal government wiretapping of journalists, corruption between officials and media owners, and an increase in threats and attacks on media workers. And when one considers that in 2006, the country was way up in the measure of media freedom, and where it is now, it does show the extent of the crisis that has affected this country. What has been the response from the government to all of these unanimous assessments of the situation in the country? Unfortunately, a deafening silence. The leader of the ruling party, Nikola Gruevski, continues to claim that the wiretapping of communications was the work of foreign intelligence services, which he has so far refused to name. At this stage, no one believes such a theory anymore. Yet he and his party followers persist in this deception and falsehood. By refusing to accept its responsibility in the many cases of abuse of power revealed in the wiretapping conversations, the ruling party is guilty of the crime of silence. In the same vein, the ruling party, which controls all the levers of power in the country, is guilty of the crime of silence in not recognizing the many instances of violation of human rights and basic democratic standards throughout the 10 years of its rule. It is guilty of destroying the social fabric of Macedonian society, of spreading fear through intimidation, of promoting violence through confrontational politics, and of fomenting inter-ethnic tensions through its one-sided ethno-nationalist behavior. It is also guilty of spreading fear and promoting intimidation tactics among civil servants, as highlighted notably in the PRIBA report and in the OSCE ODIHR reports on past elections. Even the business community is not spared in these intimidation tactics on the part of the ruling party, which unleashes its army of tax inspectors, particularly prior to elections, a practice which one would define as equivalent to inspector terrorism. Other instances of the crime of silence are the following. Firstly, the public prosecutor for selectively prosecuting offenders, to quote the above-mentioned State Department report. For example, for bringing charges against architecture students in 2010, but systematically refusing to bring charges against those who repeatedly perpetrated violent acts against the LGBT community, or against those involved in violent acts in Centaur municipality against the mayor and his office, even though all those responsible were clearly identifiable. Secondly, the President of the country for issuing a blanket pardon of many senior government and party officials under investigation brought forward by the Special Prosecutor for serious abuse of power. Not even the President can be above the law, yet he seems to have conveniently forgotten that fact. Thirdly, the judiciary for not functioning independently of the ruling party. Fourthly, the government-supported media for spreading deceit and government propaganda with no effort whatsoever at objective reporting. There are, meanwhile, those pseudo-intellectuals, apologists for the ruling party, who claim that those reports mentioned above are all part of an international conspiracy against Macedonia because of the name issue or some obscure strategic interests. It would, I fear, require much imagination to invent what strategic interest a tiny country of 2 million people could offer. Such claims are made by people in denial who refuse to accept the reality on the ground. They refuse to accept the overwhelming evidence mounting against the ruling party. They are guilty of the crime of silence. Dear friends, there are always bright lights, no matter how dark the horizon. And here we do have some extraordinary bright lights. And certainly one of those, or many of those, are the thousands of people who have poured out in the streets over the past weeks to protest against the government. The response from the ruling party castigating them as hooligans is typical of an authoritarian regime and one which, as Nelson Mandela would quote, they have the fear of the people. These courageous students, men and women of conscience, civil society organizations, and people from all walks of life are not there because of free sandwiches, as is invariably the case with Vimro de Pemene rallies. They are there because they have had enough of their human rights being trampled on, of being taken for granted, of being subjected to the dictatorship of relentless party slogans, and of being denied respect by the ruling party just because they speak out and demand a return to democratic standards. They have a voice, and that voice must be heard. Civil society must be given a space in the solution to the political crisis. This is the essence of a democratic and pluralist society. By speaking out against the worst excesses of the ruling party, by standing tall and dignified in the mediocrity which is spread by the ruling party, they will ensure that the days of this regime, which sadly is rotten to the core, are soon over. Another equally bright light is the brave stand taken by the Special Prosecutor and her team, all dedicated to the cause of justice and upholding the rule of law. Despite fierce attacks from the ruling party and from the leader himself, despite repeated intimidation tactics and disrespectful behavior towards her by senior government and ruling party officials, the Special Prosecutor and her office has stood firm and has continued to work. In doing so, the office has pursued a dignified, pioneering effort to uphold the rule of law and to ensure that those accused of serious violations and abuse of power will be brought to justice. But what justice? We have seen how the courts function under the current system. What guarantee is there of due process? People must be able to have confidence in the judicial process in order to guarantee a return to basic democratic standards. Is this possible under the current regime? Well, the Priba report does suggest that the country does possess a comprehensive set of rules, and I quote, which, if fully observed, should generally ensure a proper functioning of the judicial system to a high standard. But this presupposes an end to the pressure and intimidation exercised by the ruling party over the judiciary. So this is the challenge facing Macedonia, and it will require in particular rigid scrutiny by the European Union and the United States, together with the OSCE and the Council of Europe, to ensure that the standards guaranteeing a judiciary functioning independently are fully respected. Peace and stability will only be restored in the country if, firstly, those ruling party and senior government officials under investigation for serious abuse of power and corruption are brought to justice. And secondly, sufficient time is allowed to prepare the country for a proper electoral process free from all the many irregularities of the past, irregularities that have been highlighted, documented in all the reports that I mentioned, intimidation and so many other aspects that have marred past elections. This means that all the elements of the electoral process, including proper control over use of state funds, financing of political parties, the guarantee of an independent media, are effectively in place before an election can take place. And above all, a critical role should be played by civil society organizations, the academic community and independent media in promoting open debates and dialogue across the country, free from the intimidation of the past years. And if you look at other conflict situations, like the one in Northern Ireland up to the 1998 agreement, you will see that the involvement of civil society and the space created in the peace process for civil society brought very positive dividends for the peace process after the Good Friday Agreement. And this must be done here also. And this open debate throughout the country would help to restore the social fabric of a society deeply traumatized by years of divisive politics, where people have been categorized as being either patriots or enemies of the state or traitors. It would also allow moderate voices to emerge, including new forces in the political structures. So it's quite clear that the time for change is more than ever urgent and necessary if this country is to survive as a functioning democracy. And I dearly hope that this will be very soon. Thank you very much. And now I'm delighted and honored to pass the floor to Professor Ana Čupéska.